The year was 1876, and the dust of the Arizona Territory tasted of grit and endings. For Evelyn Hart, it was also the taste of a beginning. The stagecoach had left her at the turnoff an hour ago. A solitary figure against a backdrop of rock and sky so vast it threatened to swallow her whole. She was 25 years old, and all she owned was contained in a single, scuffed leather satchel. Behind her lay Gallup, a failed mercantile, a father buried 2 years prior, and the suffocating promise of a marriage to a man whose touch felt like a foreclosure. Ahead lay Red Mesa Station, a smudge of adobe and wood shimmering in the heat. She walked, her boots sinking into the fine red sand that covered everything. The wind was a constant, dry hand against her face, whispering through the sparse, skeletal branches of creosote bushes and the proud spines of saguaro cacti that stood like silent sentinels. Her mother, gone so long now, had loved stories of the desert, of its harsh beauty and the flowers that bloomed against all odds. Eve clutched the handle of her satchel and tried to see the beauty, but all she felt was the profound, aching emptiness of the landscape. It mirrored the space inside her chest. Red Mesa Station was less a station and more a stubborn outpost against the wilderness. A long, low main building with a wide porch sagged in the middle, flanked by a corral and a large hay barn. A blacksmith shed stood off to one side, its forge cold. As Eve drew closer, she saw the place was worn but clean. A man sat on the porch steps, methodically mending a piece of harness. He was old, with a face mapped by sun and time, his hands gnarled but steady. He looked up as her shadow fell over him. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held a weary kindness. He asked if she was lost. Eve straightened her shoulders, a gesture more for her own benefit than for his. She said she was not lost. She was looking for work. She could cook, she could clean, she could keep ledgers. Her father had been a clerk, and he had taught her letters and numbers with a firm, precise hand. She needed only a room and board, a chance to stand on her own feet without being beholden to anyone. The old man introduced himself as Quinn, the owner of the station. He looked her over, his gaze lingering on the determined set of her jaw and the lack of a wedding band on her finger. A woman alone in this country was a rare and often troubled sight. He asked where her people were. She told him she had none left to speak of. The answer was simple, unadorned, and it hung in the air between them with a weight he seemed to understand. He grunted, a sound that was not unkindly, and gestured toward the main building. He said the kitchen had been without a proper cook since his wife passed. The books were a mess he tackled only when necessary. If she could make a decent stew and her numbers added up, she could have the small room off the pantry. Relief washed over Eve so keenly it almost buckled her knees. She thanked him, her voice thick. He just nodded, turning back to his harness. He told her the well was out back. Water was to be used sparingly. Every drop was precious. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the arrival of the twice-weekly stage. Eve scrubbed the kitchen until the wooden counters shone. She organized the pantry, baked bread that filled the station with a scent of home it had long forgotten, and made a thick beef and bean stew that had the stage drivers sighing with pleasure. At night, by the light of a single kerosene lamp, she untangled the knotted mess of Quinn's ledgers, her pen scratching softly in the quiet. She learned the silent language of the station, the groan of the well pump, the nicker of horses at dawn, the way the wind carried the scent of rain long before a cloud appeared. She also learned about the water, not just the station well, but the source of all life in this arid bowl of land. A small, year-round spring tucked into a crease of the nearby mesa, a place the Dine, the Navajo people who lived on the surrounding lands, called Tubiani, water that flows through rock. Quinn spoke of it with a reverence usually reserved for scripture. His own deed, signed and sealed decades ago, guaranteed his access to it, a right as solid as the mesa itself. It was why the station could survive. It was why anyone could. One afternoon, a small boy named Tommy, the son of a freight driver who often passed through, was chasing a lizard near the corral. Eve was watching him from the kitchen window, a faint smile on her face. When she saw the riders approach, there were 3 of them, not dusty travelers or local ranchers. They rode fine horses and wore city clothes that looked out of place against the raw landscape. The man in the lead was stout, with a face that seemed permanently flushed with impatience and cheap whiskey. He dismounted with the proprietary air of a man who believed the ground was honored to receive him. He introduced himself to Quinn as Harlan Pike, a representative of the Transcontinental Railroad. His voice was oily and loud. He did not offer a handshake. He unrolled a document with a flourish, its official-looking seals and dense script seeming like a weapon in the stark sunlight. Pike announced that the railroad had acquired provisional water rights to the entire basin, including the spring at Tubiani. He slapped the paper. It was all legal. He boomed. The government wanted progress, and progress required water for the steam engines that would soon thunder through this land. He offered Quinn a paltry sum to buy out his station and his obsolete claim. Quinn's face, usually so placid, hardened. He told Pike his claim was as old as the territory and as valid as the sunrise. He would not sell. His water was for the people and the animals who depended on it, not for a machine. Pike's smile was a thin, unpleasant thing. He suggested Quinn find his original paperwork. Without it, this new federal grant superseded any dusty old memory of a claim. He and his men lingered, their presence a poison in the air. They walked the perimeter of the station, their eyes calculating and cold. Eve felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. This was the same kind of power she had fled, the kind that used paper and pronouncements to steal a person's world out from under them. The confrontation simmered for 2 days. Pike and his men took rooms, paying in coin that felt like an insult. They drank Quinn's whiskey and spoke loudly of the changes that were coming, of the new order that would sweep away the old ways. Eve kept her head down, her hands busy with dough and laundry, but her ears were open. She watched Pike, the way his eyes never settled, always assessing, always looking for a weakness. The 3rd evening, things came to a head. Pike cornered Quinn on the porch, his voice a low snarl. He told the old man his patience was at an end. Quinn stood his ground, his back straight, telling Pike to take his railroad money and leave his home. One of Pike's men, a lanky brute with a mean streak in his eyes, shoved Quinn. The old man stumbled back against a post, his face pale with shock and fury. Eve started forward from the doorway. A cry caught in her throat, but the other man blocked her path with a sneer. Pike laughed. He said this was just a taste of progress. He nodded to the lanky man, who then strolled casually toward the hay barn, a lit cigarillo in his hand. Terror, cold and sharp, seized Eve. She saw the man flick the cigarillo into the dry, loose hay near the barn door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a tiny orange serpent of flame appeared, tasted the air, and lunged. The fire roared to life with a greedy, explosive whoosh. The dry timber and decades of stored hay erupted into a tower of flame that painted the twilight sky in hellish shades of orange and red. The horses in the corral screamed, their eyes wide with panic. Little Tommy, who had been playing with a stray kitten near the barn, was frozen in place, mesmerized by the terrible beauty of the flames. A heavy, burning beam groaned, splintered, and began to fall directly toward him. Quinn shouted the boy's name, a sound of pure anguish. Time seemed to slow. Eve saw the beam falling, the boy transfixed, the world narrowing to a single, awful point of impact. Then came a sound she could not place, a sharp crack, like a whip, but flatter, more final. A splinter of wood flew from the top of the failing beam, a small, dark hole appearing an instant later. The shot altered its trajectory just enough. The massive timber crashed to the ground inches from where Tommy stood, showering him with sparks but leaving him untouched. The boy, jolted from his trance, scrambled away, sobbing, Pike and his men stared, dumbfounded, toward the high ridge of the mesa that overlooked the station. Eve's eyes followed their gaze. For a heartbeat, she saw nothing but the deepening purple of the rock against the fiery sky. Then she saw him, a figure on horseback, as still and silent as the stone he stood upon. He was too far away to make out any details. But the silhouette was unmistakable. A warrior, lean and straight, holding a rifle. He was a shadow, a ghost conjured by the firelight. He did not move or fire again. He simply watched. The silent judgment from the ridge was more unnerving than a volley of shots would have been. Pike, his face a mask of fury and something that looked like fear, barked orders at his men. They mounted their horses clumsily and galloped away, swallowed by the growing darkness, leaving the fire and chaos behind them. Eve ran with Quinn and the stage drivers to the well. Forming a frantic bucket brigade, they fought the blaze with a desperate, futile energy. But the barn was a total loss. They could only save the surrounding buildings, their faces blackened with soot, their lungs aching from smoke. Hours later, when the fire had burned down to a smoldering, glowing heart of embers, Eve stood near the well, catching her breath. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a trembling in her limbs. The station was saved, but the violation lingered. She felt a presence behind her and turned, her heart lurching. It was not one of Pike's men. It was the man from the ridge. He had approached without a sound, his moccasined feet silent on the hard-packed earth. He was tall, taller than any man she had ever seen up close, with broad shoulders and a quiet, powerful stillness. He wore simple buckskin leggings and a calico shirt. His black hair was tied back with a strip of cloth, and his face was all stark planes and angles, handsome in a way that seemed carved from the very rock of the mesa. His eyes were dark, and they held the vast, patient wisdom of the land itself. He held his rifle loosely in one hand. They stood in silence for a long moment. The crackle of the dying fire, the only sound. Eve found her voice, a hoarse whisper. She said, "Thank you. For the boy." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. His gaze moved from her face to the smoking ruins of the barn, then to the dark line of the horizon where Pike had vanished. His English was clear, accented with the soft, musical cadence of the Dine tongue. He told her those men would be back. Eve knew he was right. She asked what they wanted. His dark eyes met hers again, and in their depths, she saw a sorrow as old as the hills. The answer was simple, direct, and it settled in her soul with the weight of an undeniable truth. He said they wanted the water. Water is life. They take the water. They take everything. He turned then, and as silently as he had appeared, he melted back into the shadows, leaving Evelyn Hart standing alone in the wounded heart of Red Mesa Station, the warrior's words echoing in the vast, silent dark. In the gray light of dawn, the ruin of the barn was a black, skeletal wound against the soft pinks of the sky. The smell of wet ash and charred pine hung heavy in the air. Quinn looked older than he had the day before, a decade etched onto his face by a single night of fire. But as Eve emerged from the main house, a pot of coffee in her hands, she saw not defeat in his eyes, but a quiet, smoldering anger. They did not speak of the fire. They spoke of what needed to be done. The surviving horses had to be moved to a makeshift pen. The debris had to be cleared. The station, wounded as it was, had to continue. The stage was due in 2 days. In the weeks that followed, the kitchen became Eve's fortress and her sanctuary. She worked with a fierce, focused energy, as if she could rebuild the barn with bread and mend the violation with stew. She was paying a debt, not just for the room and board, but for the quiet way Quinn had accepted her. No questions asked. She learned the desert's hard lessons. She learned to measure the water for washing by the cupful, reusing the gray water for the small, struggling herb garden she planted by the kitchen door. She learned to grind the tough blue corn the Dines sometimes traded for flour and to bake flat. dense cakes on a hot stone that were surprisingly delicious. They were honest food, like the land itself. Quinn, watching her work, began to teach her other things. How to read the clouds for the hint of a storm. How to treat a rope burn with aloe from a spiky plant near the porch. How to listen to the silence and hear the approach of a rider a mile away. Sometimes, when she was gathering herbs or walking near the edge of the station's property, she would feel a prickling on the back of her neck, the sensation of being watched. She would scan the high red rocks of the mesa, her eyes searching the shadows and contours of the stone. She never saw anyone, but she felt a presence, a silent guardianship that was both unsettling and strangely comforting. She knew it was the tall warrior, the man Quinn called destinies. He was a whisper, a shadow, a protector who kept his distance. Quinn told her the Dine had to be careful. Army patrols from the fort still rode through the territory, their memories of old conflicts long and their suspicions easily aroused. To be seen as a threat was a danger the Dine could not afford. The threat of Harlan Pike did not disappear with the smoke. It simply changed its form. A week after the fire, a man wearing a tarnished deputy's star rode in from the nearest town. His name was Klein, and he had a swagger that did not quite hide the weakness in his chin. He did not come with accusations. He came with paperwork. He informed Quinn that, due to the recent fire and questions of liability, the county required a new filing of all original deeds and claims. He also mentioned a new tax on commercial wells, a tax Pike had apparently lobbied the territorial government to approve. Quinn's hands shook with a quiet rage. He told Klein his deed was perfectly valid. Klein smiled, a slick, knowing expression. He said he was sure it was, but the law was the law. The original document had to be presented. Quinn blustered, then fell silent. Later, when Klein had gone, leaving the scent of cheap cigars and menace behind him, Quinn confessed to Eve, the original deed, the one signed by a territorial governor long since dead, was not in his strongbox. He could not remember the last time he had seen it. Decades ago, he had made a copy and, for safekeeping, had left the original with the circuit preacher, who stored important documents in the small adobe chapel a day's ride away. But the preacher had died, and the chapel had fallen into disuse years ago. Whether the papers were still there, or had turned to dust and mouse nests, he did not know. The uncertainty gnawed at him. To distract himself from the gnawing worry, Quinn would sometimes talk, telling Eve stories of the old days. Through him, she began to understand the deeper currents of this place. He spoke of the Dean not as savages, as she had so often heard them described, but as a people with a deep and complicated history, bound to the land by threads of story and spirit. He told her about the Long Walk. He did not use the history book term. He spoke of it as the time the world ended. He described how, more than a decade before, the army had forced the Dine from their lands, marching them hundreds of miles to a desolate camp in New Mexico. He spoke of the starvation, the sickness, the bitter cold, and the children who were buried along the way. He spoke of the ones who returned, a broken but resilient people, to a homeland that was no longer wholly theirs. The wound, he said, was still fresh. It lived in the memories of the old ones, in the caution in the eyes of the young. It was why they were so fiercely protective of what little they had left. It was why a man like destinies watched from the mesas. He was guarding not just a spring, but a memory and a future. One afternoon, an old Dine woman came to the station. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her face a beautiful web of wrinkles, her silver and turquoise jewelry gleaming against her dark velveteen blouse. She did not speak English, but she carried a finely woven blanket, its patterns telling a story of sky and earth. She wanted to trade for flour and sugar. Quinn was out checking a fence line, so Eve dealt with her. Using gestures and smiles, they made their trade. As the woman was leaving, she paused and touched a small, struggling wildflower that had pushed its way up through the hard, cracked earth near the kitchen steps. She looked at Eve, and her dark, ancient eyes held a universe of understanding. She said a single word in her own language and then was gone. Eve did not know what it meant, but she felt its warmth long after the woman had disappeared. Later, she learned the woman was Astza Yazi, a respected matriarch. She was Atsidi's mother. The fragile piece was a thin sheet of ice over a deep, cold river of tension. Eve felt it every day. In the way young Tommy, the freight driver's son, now spent his afternoons practicing with a slingshot, aiming at cans and pretending to be a great warrior defending the station. In the way Quinn would fall silent for long stretches, staring at the charred remains of his barn. While sorting through the chaotic pile of papers in Quinn's office, searching for any scrap that might help, Eve found her own way to fight back. She told Quinn that her father had been a court clerk and had taught her the importance of order, with his permission. She began to organize the ledgers, her script clear and precise, her columns of numbers balanced to the penny. It was a small thing, a quiet act of defiance, but it made her feel less helpless. She was not a warrior with a rifle, but she had a pen, and she could make sense of chaos. It was a skill, and she was beginning to understand that in the coming fight, every skill would be needed. The first cold snap of autumn arrived without warning. The days were still warm, but the nights turned sharp and brittle, the stars in the black sky looking like chips of ice. A fierce wind blew from the north, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow. It was on one such night, long after the station had settled into sleep, that Eve was awakened by a frantic pounding on the kitchen door. She grabbed a heavy iron skillet, her heart hammering against her ribs, and crept to the door. Through the small window, she saw a dying man, his face etched with panic in the moonlight. He was young, and he was alone. She cautiously opened the door. He spoke in a torrent of Dine, his hands gesturing wildly toward a small shape huddled under a blanket by the corral. Eve could not understand his words, but his terror was a universal language. She followed him, the skillet still held tight in her hand. Under the blanket was a young woman, his wife, her body racked with shivers, her face contorted in pain. She was pregnant, far too pregnant, and it was clear the baby was coming now, weeks too soon. Quinn appeared in the main doorway, a shotgun in his hands, his face grim. He saw the situation and hesitated. Helping them could mean trouble. Klein and Pike were looking for any excuse to cause problems, and harboring Navajos could be twisted into a crime. But Eve did not hesitate. She saw only a woman in agony, a husband in despair. She looked at Quinn, her expression pleading. This was not about politics or land rights. It was about a baby, about a life fighting to enter a cold, hard world. She said they had to help. She would take responsibility. Her resolve broke through his caution. He lowered the gun and nodded. Together, they helped the young woman into the kitchen, the warmest room in the station. Eve stoked the fire in the big cast-iron stove until it glowed red, filling the room with a deep, steady heat. She bolted the door and hung a thick blanket over the window. The kitchen became an island of warmth and light against the vast, cold darkness of the desert. Eve sent the husband for Shiyaji, the healer Quinn had told her about, though she knew the woman lived miles away and might not arrive in time. Then, with a prayer to a god she was not sure she still believed in, she set to work. She remembered things she had heard from her mother, things whispered between the women in Gallup. She boiled water. She tore clean flour sacks into strips. She spoke to the young woman in a low, soothing voice, her tone a balm even if her words were not understood. Hours passed. The wind howled outside, but inside the kitchen, a primal, timeless drama unfolded. It was a world of sweat and pain, of gritted teeth and soft groans, of whispered encouragement and the steady, rhythmic roar of the stove. Eve was no midwife, but she was a woman, and she had a deep well of compassion she had not known she possessed. She held the young woman's hand, wiped her brow, and breathed with her through the waves of pain. Just before dawn, with a final, ragged cry, the baby was born. It was terrifyingly small, a tiny, perfect creature with a shock of black hair, For a heart-stopping moment, it was silent. Then it let out a thin, wavering cry, a sound more precious than gold. Relief and exhaustion washed over Eve in a dizzying wave. She wrapped the infant in the softest cloth she could find and placed him in his mother's arms. The young mother looked down at her son, her face luminous with love and weariness, and then she looked at Eve. She whispered a word of thanks, her English halting but clear. At that moment, the door opened softly. An old woman entered, followed by the young husband and the matriarch, Astza Yazi, the healer. Shiyaji was a woman with eyes that seemed to see everything. She moved to the mother and child, her hands gentle and sure as she checked them both. Astza Yazi, Atsidi's mother, stood by the door. Her stern, proud face was unreadable. She looked at the warm room, at the exhausted but peaceful mother and her child, and then her gaze settled on Eve. Eve met her eyes, her own face smudged with soot and sweat. She was no longer just a hired cook, a stranger passing through. In the warmth of her kitchen, in the face of the howling wind, she had chosen her ground. She had offered sanctuary. Astza Yazi held her gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, she gave a single, deep nod. It was not just a gesture of gratitude. It was an acknowledgement. A bond had been forged in the heart of that cold night. A thread of trust woven not with words, but with the shared, sacred work of bringing a new life into the world. The trust born in the warm kitchen did not stop the cold wind of the law from blowing. 2 weeks later, Harlan Pike returned. He was not alone. With him was a man in a black wool suit that looked miserably out of place in the desert heat, and Deputy Klein, who lounged on his horse with a look of smug authority. The man in the suit introduced himself as Pike's legal counsel, a Mr. Finch, who spoke in long, looping sentences that twisted simple ideas into unrecognizable knots. He unfurled another set of documents, newer and more intimidating than the last. He spoke of eminent domain, of territorial development acts, and of the railroad's federally granted provisional water rights. He explained, with the condescending patience of a man swatting a fly, that in the absence of a registered, notarized, and physically present original deed, Quinn's claim to Tubiayani was nothing more than anecdotal, a memory, and memories. Mr. Finch said with a thin smile, held no standing in a court of law. Quinn stood on his porch, his face pale, his hands clenched at his sides. He was a man of handshakes and spoken words, of honor that needed no seal or signature. This new language of paper and power was a foreign tongue designed to confuse and conquer him. He tried to argue, but his words were clumsy things, batted away with ease by Finch's polished phrases. Eve stood in the doorway, the ledger book heavy in her hands. She listened to the lawyer's slick, empty words, and felt the same cold fury she had on the night of the fire. This was not justice. It was an ambush with ink and paper instead of torches. Pike gave them a deadline. 1 week. Produce the original deed. Or he would return with a federal marshal and a court order to begin construction of a pumping station at the spring. As they rode away, Klein shot a triumphant smirk in their direction, his eyes lingering on Eve for a moment too long. That night, the station was wrapped in a heavy silence. Quinn sat at the kitchen table, staring into a cold cup of coffee. A defeated man. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rasp. He told Eve about the old adobe chapel in the foothills, a day's ride to the west. He told her about the circuit preacher, a man named Father Michael, who believed faith was best kept in a strongbox. Quinn had given him the deed for safekeeping 30 years ago, after his wife had worried about a fire. He had a copy somewhere, but it was the original, the one with the territorial governor's signature and seal that Finch demanded. He had not thought of it in years. Now, it was the only thing that stood between them and ruin. He was too old to make the journey. He said his bones ached and the ride would break him. His eyes, clouded with shame and worry, Found Eve's. He did not ask. He did not have to. Eve knew what she had to do, but she could not go alone. The desert was a dangerous place, and Klein's sneer promised that the danger was not only from the elements. As if summoned by her thoughts, a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness beyond the porch light. Atsidi Nez stepped into the faint yellow glow. He had clearly been waiting, listening. He had seen Pike and his men arrive, and he had understood. He looked at Quinn, then at Eve. There was no need for explanation. His presence was an answer. He said he would guide her. The Diney knew the paths to the old chapel. A small voice piped up from the doorway. Little Tommy stood there, his slingshot in his hand, his face set with a fierce determination that was far older than his 8 years. He said he was going too. He was a scout. He knew the land, and he was fast. He looked at Atsidi, his eyes full of hero worship. Eve started to protest. It was too dangerous for a child. But Quinn put a hand on her arm. The boy needed this, he said quietly. After the fire, he needed to feel he was a part of the fight, not just a victim. Atsidi looked down at the boy, a long, considering look. Then he gave a slow nod. A small scout could be useful. He would be under Atsidi's protection. They left before dawn the next morning, 3 riders against the immense, silent landscape. Atsidi led the way, his tall frame a confident silhouette against the rising sun. Eve followed, her mare steady, and Tommy brought up the rear on a shaggy pony, his back ramrod straight. The fear that had been a cold knot in Eve's stomach began to loosen as they rode. The raw, empty beauty of the land was overwhelming. It was a place of subtle wonders that revealed themselves only to the patient. Atsidi taught her as they rode. His words were few, but his lessons were profound. He pointed to the barely perceptible trail of a sidewinder in the sand. He showed her how a certain type of cactus, when split open, held a mouthful of precious, life-giving water. He taught her to read the flight of a hawk as a sign of a thermal, a rising current of warm air that spoke of the day's coming heat. Tommy was an eager student, absorbing every word. He pointed out a jackrabbit, a flash of brown and white, and Atsidi taught him the name for it in the Dine language. For a few hours, they were not a desperate party on a vital mission, but simply 3 people moving through the quiet majesty of the world. Eve felt a sense of peace she had not known in years. Here, away from the suffocating rules of towns and the predatory words of men like Pike, she could simply be. They reached the abandoned chapel in the late afternoon. It stood in a small, wind-swept canyon, a crumbling monument to a faith that had moved on. The adobe walls were scarred and pitted by wind and rain. The roof had partially collapsed, and the heavy wooden door hung from a single leather hinge. A rusted iron cross tilted precariously from the peak of the front wall, a symbol of a forgotten promise. Inside, the air was thick with the dust of decay and the smell of old paper and mice. Pews lay overturned. Sunlight streamed through holes in the roof, illuminating dancing motes of dust. It felt like a tomb. They began to search. It was a hopeless task at first. Piles of water-damaged hymnals and rotting vestments filled the small sacristy. Atsidi moved with a quiet efficiency, his eyes scanning every corner, while Tommy, his initial excitement fading into the gloom, poked into dusty cubbyholes. Eve worked methodically, her heart sinking with every empty box and crumbling book she opened. It was Tommy who found it. Tucked beneath a loose floorboard behind the ruined altar was a small, iron strongbox. It was not locked, but rusted shut. Atsidi, with a firm, steady pressure, forced the lid open with the tip of his hunting knife. Inside, nestled on a bed of what had once been velvet, lay a thick, leather-bound Bible. Its cover was stiff, its pages yellowed and brittle. Eve lifted it out with reverent hands. As she opened it, a folded vellum document slipped from between the pages of the Old Testament. She carefully unfolded it. The ink was faded, the script ornate, but the words were clear. It was the original deed to Red Mesa Station and its surrounding lands, including full and unending rights to the waters of the spring known as Tubiani. At the bottom was the bold, flourishing signature of a territorial governor and a heavy, embossed seal, Hope, bright and sharp, pierced through the gloom. Eve laughed, a sound of pure relief that echoed strangely in the silent chapel. They rode back with a renewed sense of purpose, the precious document wrapped in oilcloth and tucked safely in Eve's satchel. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, painting the western sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. They decided to make camp in a sheltered cove of rock and press on to the station at first light. As Atsidi was starting a small, smokeless fire, the first shot rang out. The bullet whined past Eve's head, so close she felt its heat, and slammed into the rock behind her, sending a spray of sharp fragments into the air. Tommy cried out, a sound of surprise and pain. In an instant, Atsidi was moving. He shoved Eve and Tommy behind a large boulder, his body shielding them. "Get down and stay down," he commanded, his voice low and calm, cutting through Eve's sudden, paralyzing fear. He drew his rifle, his movements fluid and economical, and melted into the rocks, becoming one with the shadows. Eve's hands were shaking as she pulled Tommy closer. He was crying silently, clutching his arm. A piece of flying rock had sliced a deep gash just above his elbow. Blood, dark in the fading light, stained his sleeve. It was not a serious wound, but the sight of it sent a fresh wave of terror through her. Another shot cracked from the ridge above them, answered almost immediately by the deeper boom of Atsidi's rifle. A man yelled out in pain. The world became a terrifying cacophony of echoes and ricochets. Eve could see nothing but the rock in front of her and the darkening sky above. She pressed Tommy's face into her shoulder, murmuring soothing words she did not feel, her body trembling. This was real. This was not a legal argument or a threat. This was men with guns trying to kill them. The gunfight was short and brutal. Eve heard Atsidi's rifle speak 3 more times, each shot measured and precise. After the last one, an unnerving silence fell over the canyon, broken only by Tommy's quiet sobs and the whisper of the wind. After a long, tense minute, Atsidi reappeared. He was unharmed. There was a grim set to his jaw, but his eyes were clear. He told them it was over. 2 men. They would not be troubling anyone again. He knelt beside Tommy, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he examined the boy's arm. He tore a strip from his own shirt and, after cleaning the wound with water from his canteen, bound it tightly. He looked at Eve, his dark eyes meeting hers over the boy's head. In that shared glance, a new understanding passed between them. They had faced death together, and he had protected her and the child. The trust she had felt before deepened into something stronger, something forged in violence and fear. While Eve comforted Tommy, Atsidi went to check the ridge. He returned a few minutes later, his face a hard mask. He carried no trophies, but he held something in his hand. He opened his palm. Lying there was a half-smoked cheroot, its end still damp. It was a specific, cheap brand, one she had seen before. Deputy Klein smoked those cheroots constantly, leaving a trail of them wherever he went. The proof was as undeniable as the deed in her satchel. This was not just Pike's greed. The law itself, in the form of its hired gun, had tried to murder them to prevent that small piece of paper from ever reaching the light of day. They had the evidence to save the station, but now they knew. The fight for water was no longer a battle of words. It was a battle of blood. They rode into the station yard under the cold light of the stars, the precious deed a heavy, triumphant weight in Eve's satchel. Quinn was waiting on the porch, a lantern held high, his face a mask of anxiety. When Eve showed him the vellum, his shoulders, which had been stooped with worry for days, straightened. A faint, watery light of hope returned to his eyes. He took the document in his hands as if it were a holy relic. Their relief, however, was short-lived. tempered by the grim reality of the ambush. When Atsidi showed Quinn the cheap cheroot butt, the old man's face hardened into a granite slab of fury. The knowledge that Klein, a man sworn to uphold the law, had sent men to kill them, settled over the station like a shroud. They had the paper, but Pike had the power, and he had shown he was not afraid to use violence to get his way. The next day dawned strange and unnerving. The air was wrong. A hot, dry wind began to blow from the east, a wind that felt as though it were coming straight from the mouth of a furnace. It was a Santa Ana, Quinn said, his eyes scanning the hazy, dust-choked horizon. They came early this year. The wind had a life of its own, a restless, malevolent spirit. It rattled the windows, tore at the loose shingles on the roof, and sent tumbleweeds cartwheeling across the yard like frantic, skeletal creatures. The very air felt electric, humming with a nervous, dangerous energy that set everyone on edge. The world was tinder dry, waiting for a spark. The spark came that night. It began as a flicker on the horizon, a faint, unsteady orange glow against the black silhouette of the mesa. Eve saw it first from the kitchen window. At first, she thought it was a late campfire, but the glow did not stay small. It grew, brightening and spreading with an unnatural speed, painting the underside of the low-hanging dust clouds with a pulsing, threatening light. A shout went up from the corral. The wind, which had been a constant moan all day, was now carrying a new sound, a distant, angry crackle. And with it, a new smell. Not the clean scent of a piñon fire, but the acrid, choking smell of burning grass and sage. The fire was near to Be'ani. It was moving fast, driven by the relentless wind. A wall of flame racing across the dry plains, straight for the lifeblood of the entire region. For a moment, chaos reigned. Men ran from the bunkhouse, shouting and pointing. The horses screamed in the corral, their eyes rolling with terror. Quinn stood frozen on the porch, the deed clutched in his hand, his face a canvas of disbelief and despair. Pike had not waited for the deadline. He had chosen his weapon, and it was the oldest and most terrible of all. In that moment of panic, something inside Eve went still and cold. The fear was there, a knot of ice in her belly. But on the surface, a strange, sharp clarity took hold. She was done being a victim. She was done reacting. She strode out into the yard, her voice cutting through the frightened shouts, clear and commanding. She told the stable hand to get the horses out of the corral and into the far pasture, away from the smoke. She pointed at two of the freight drivers. She wanted buckets, every bucket, pail, and basin in the station. Form a line to the well. She grabbed Quinn's arm, her grip firm, jolting him from his stupor. She told him they needed blankets, every horse blanket and spare quilt they could find. Soak them in the horse trough. People stared at her, their face slack with shock. But there was a certainty in her voice that brooked no argument. They were desperate for a plan, and she had given them one. They began to move, their panic channeled into frantic, purposeful action. A human chain formed, passing buckets of precious water from the well. Men and women worked side by side, their faces grim in the flickering firelight. Eve was at the head of the line, taking the soaked, heavy blankets and running toward the spreading edge of the fire, her lungs burning, her eyes streaming. They would beat at the smaller flames, trying to smother them, to create a desperate, narrow line of defense. It was a losing battle. For every flame they extinguished, a dozen more leaped up, carried on the wind. The heat was a physical blow, sucking the air from their lungs. The roar was deafening. Ashen embers rained down on them, hot and stinging. Eve worked until her arms felt like lead, until her face was black with soot and her throat was raw. She could feel despair beginning to creep back in, cold and final. They were too few, the fire was too big, too fast. And then they were there. They came not from the road, but from the darkness itself. a dozen riders emerging from the night like spirits of the land. Atsidi Nez was at their head, his face stark and emotionless in the firelight. He and his men were stripped to the waist, their bodies lean and powerful. They carried not buckets, but shovels, axes, and wet hides. They did not join the feudal bucket line. They rode past it, heading straight for a place where the fire had not yet reached, 100 yards ahead of the main blaze. With a shouted command from Atsidi, they dismounted and went to work with a terrifying, coordinated efficiency. They were not trying to put the fire out, they were redirecting it. With axes, they cleared a wide path through the sagebrush, chopping it down to the bare earth. With shovels, they dug a long, shallow trench. Throwing the dirt onto the side closest to the fire, they were creating a firebreak, a scar on the land that the flames could not cross. It was a strategy born of generations of knowledge, a deep understanding of the land and its unforgiving nature. Even the others stopped, watching in awe. They saw another group of figures emerge from the darkness near the station. It was the women. Azah Yazi, Atsidi's mother, was among them, her face calm and resolute. She gathered the frightened women and children from the station, her presence a silent, powerful anchor in the storm of chaos. She did not panic, she organized. She led them to the root cellar, the safest place from the smoke and embers, her calm authority a balm on their terror. The fire reached the break. It roared and lunged, a living beast trying to leap the gap. For a long, terrible moment, it seemed it would succeed. Embers flew across the trench, igniting small spot fires on the other side, but Atsidi's men were ready, beating them out with their wet hides before they could grow. The main wall of flame hit the cleared earth and, with nowhere to go, and nothing to consume, it faltered. It clawed at the sky, a furious, frustrated column of fire and smoke, and then, slowly, it began to die down along the line. They had turned it. They had saved the spring. As the immediate danger passed, another figure moved through the smoky haze. Shiaji, the healer, her medicine bag slung over her shoulder. She went from person to person, her touch gentle, her eyes missing nothing. She treated burns with a cool salve and washed the stinging ash from people's eyes. Quinn had a bad burn on his right hand, the skin red and blistering where he had grabbed a fallen, smoldering fence post to drag it from the fire's path. He had barely seemed to notice it in the heat of the fight, but now the pain was setting in. As Shayaji tended to the others, Eve led Quinn to the kitchen and gently washed his hand in a basin of cool well water. He winced, but did not pull away. The ash came off, revealing the angry, damaged skin beneath. She looked at his hand, the hand that had offered her a home, now scarred in defense of it. An overwhelming wave of gratitude and fierce loyalty washed over her, while she was wrapping his hand in a clean cloth. Atsidi came to the doorway. His face and chest were slick with sweat and streaked with soot. He was holding something. He stepped into the light and opened his hand. On his palm lay several cigar stubs, identical to the ones Pike favored. He said he found them in 3 different places, upwind from where the fire began. They had been deliberately placed in nests of the driest tumbleweeds. This was no accident of nature. It was a calculated act of war. The proof was undeniable. Pike had tried to burn them out, to destroy not just the station, but the land itself, to force them away from the water. They stood in the quiet kitchen, the 3 of them, the smell of smoke clinging to their clothes and hair. The fire outside was dying, but a new, cold fire of resolve was being kindled inside. By dawn, the wind had died. A thick gray pall of smoke lay over the valley. The land was a blackened, desolate ruin, still smoking in places. It was a landscape of loss. But in the center of the devastation, the small grove of cottonwoods that sheltered Tubiani stood untouched, an oasis of green in a world of black. The water still flowed, clear and cool, from the rock. The people of the station and the Dine stood together, surveying the damage. They were exhausted, filthy, and sore, but they were united. The fire had burned away more than grass and sagebrush. It had burned away the invisible walls of suspicion and mistrust. They were no longer just neighbors. They were allies, survivors who had faced a common enemy and won. They looked at Eve not as a newcomer or a hired cook, but as the woman who had held them together. And they looked at Atsidi and his people not as mysterious savages from the hills, but as the protectors who had saved their world. The ash on the ground was a symbol of all they had almost lost, but the water, still flowing, was a promise of a future they would now fight for together. The fire left a ghost behind. In the weeks that followed, the land lay black and silent under a sky that seemed too bright, too blue. A fine gray ash settled on everything, a constant reminder of the violence that had swept through. But amidst the devastation, a new and quiet resilience took root. The people of the station and the Dine, who had fought the flames together, now shared a silent, watchful bond. When a Dine family passed the station, they would raise a hand in greeting to Quinn, a gesture that would have been rare before the fire. A silent trade system began. A haunch of venison left on the porch in the cool of the morning. A sack of flour and a jar of Eve's preserved peaches found in its place an hour later. The stagecoach, however, brought the outside world back with all its ugly whispers. The story of the fire had reached the nearest town, but it had been twisted in the telling. The heroic, desperate fight to save the spring was overshadowed by a more salacious tale. The white woman at Red Mesa Station, alone and without family, who was keeping company with the Navajos, a woman who worked alongside their warriors, who spoke to their men. The rumors were a dust storm of another kind, fine and gritty, getting into everything, obscuring the truth. Eve felt the shift in the air when she went to the small trading post for supplies. The proprietor's wife, who had once been friendly, was now cool and distant. Women who had previously shared gossip and recipes now fell silent when Eve approached, their eyes sliding away from hers. The whispers followed her down the dusty street, words like unseemly and reckless stinging her ears. The embodiment of this judgment arrived one afternoon in a polished black buggy. Her name was Agnes Whitlow, the wife of the town's most prominent rancher and the self-appointed arbiter of moral decency for the territory's scattered white population. She was a stern, corseted woman whose smile never reached her cold, pale eyes. She came, she said, out of Christian concern for Eve's welfare. They sat in the station's main room, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Agnes spoke of a woman's reputation, how it was a fragile, delicate thing, easily broken. She spoke of the natural order, of the clear and necessary lines that must be drawn between civilized folk and the natives. Her concern was a weapon, wrapped in the soft cloth of piety. She hinted that Eve's association with the Dine, particularly with a warrior like Atsidi Nez, was not only dangerous to her good name, but a threat to the safety and stability of the entire community. Eve listened, her hands clenched in the lap of her simple calico dress. This was the same suffocating pressure she had fled in Gallup, the same cage of expectations and rules made by others. But she was not the same woman who had arrived here with nothing but a satchel and a desperate hope. She had faced fire and gunmen. She would not be cowed by gossip. She told Mrs. Whitlow, her voice quiet but firm, that the Dine had saved their homes and their lives. She said that she judged people by their actions, not by the color of their skin. Agnes Whitlow left in a cloud of disapproval, her lips pressed into a thin, hard line. After she was gone, Eve went to her small room off the pantry. She took out a length of yellow gingham she had bought months ago, a small, hopeful extravagance, with steady hands. She began to cut and sew a set of new curtains for the kitchen window. It was a simple, domestic act, but for Eve, it was a declaration. This was her home. She would not be frightened out of it. She was putting down roots, building a defense of her own making, stitch by stitch. The small, bright square of the window, framed in cheerful yellow, was a defiant piece of sunshine against the encroaching gloom. As the rumors from the town festered, Harlan Pike's man, Deputy Klein, saw his opportunity. He could not attack the station directly, not after the fire had forged such a visible alliance. So he attacked the alliance itself. He and 2 other men rode out one morning and found 3 Dine men watering their small flock of sheep at a spot downstream from the spring. They were on their own ancestral land, doing what their people had done for centuries. Klein arrested them. He did not call it an arrest. He called it a detainment for unauthorized use of private resources. He claimed that since the water originated from Debiani, a spring now under legal dispute by Mr. Pike, the men were trespassing. He hauled them into the town's shabby saloon, which doubled as his unofficial office, and declared they would be held until a water tax was paid for their transgression. The news reached the station by midday, carried by a young Dine boy who had watched the whole thing from a hidden spot in the rocks. Quinn flew into a rage, his burned hand, now bandaged and healing, clenching into a fist. This was a deliberate provocation, a test of their new, fragile peace. Eve felt a cold, clear anger settle over her. She went to the desk where she kept the ledgers. She opened the book, its columns of neat figures a testament to the station's legitimacy. Then she took out the copy she had made of the deed. The original was hidden, safe. She told Quinn she was going into town. He tried to stop her, his face etched with worry. He said it was too dangerous. Klein was a snake, and the saloon was no place for a woman. But he saw the look in her eyes, the same unyielding resolve she'd had during the fire, and he knew there was no arguing. As she walked toward the town, she saw Atsedi. He was on the ridge overlooking the road, mounted on his horse, a rifle resting across his lap. He was not there by accident. He had seen Klein's party ride out, and he had seen them return with their prisoners. He watched her now, his face impassive. He knew where she was going and why. He made no move to join her. He understood, with a wisdom that tore at Eve's heart, that his presence in the town would only ignite the flames of prejudice and give Klein the excuse he wanted for violence. He could protect her best by keeping his distance. But his eyes followed her, a silent, powerful promise that she was not alone. The saloon was a long, narrow room that smelled of stale beer, sweat, and sawdust. A dozen men were scattered at the tables, their conversations halting when Eve pushed through the swinging doors. The bright afternoon light pouring in behind her seemed an intrusion into the room's perpetual twilight. Klein was at the bar, a bottle of whiskey in front of him. Harlan Pike sat at a table nearby, looking smug. The 3 Dine men stood against the far wall, their faces proud and stoic, their hands unbound but their dignity under assault. Eve walked directly to the bar. She placed the ledger down with a solid thud that made Klein jump. She did not raise her voice. She spoke with the cold, precise clarity of a legal clerk. She informed Klein that Red Mesa Station had been in continuous operation for 35 years, a fact documented in the ledger before him. It had always shared access to the spring's runoff with its neighbors, a fact also noted in her records of trade and goodwill. She then placed the copy of the deed on the bar. She explained that it was a true copy of the original, which was now in a secure location, and that it granted Quinn undisputed rights to the spring. She pointed out that since the deed's validity was the subject of the legal dispute, no commercial rights, including the right to levy a tax, could be assigned to Harlan Pike or anyone else until a territorial judge had ruled on the matter. Therefore, his detention of these men was unlawful. It was kidnapping. A dead silence fell over the saloon. The men at the tables stared, their mouths agape. They had never heard a woman speak like this, with such authority, such command of facts and law. Pike sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. He called her a liar and an interfering busybody. One of his hired men, lounging near the prisoners, made a crude comment about what happens to white women who prefer the company of savages. Before Eve could even react, a sharp voice cut through the tense air. "That is quite enough, Mr. Davies." The voice belonged to Agnes Whitlow. She had been in the general store, its doorway offering a clear view into the saloon. She now stood just inside the swinging doors, her back rigid, her face a mask of disapproval. She had come to town to rally support against the woman at the station. She had expected to find a fallen creature, an object of pity and scorn. Instead, she had found a woman of substance and courage, standing alone, using the law as her shield and sword. Agnes Whitlow was a hard woman, a woman of prejudice and rigid rules, but she was also a mother. She had seen the fire from her ranch. She knew how close it had come, and she knew that the children in the town drank from wells fed by the same watershed as the spring. She looked from Eve's resolute face to Pike's greedy one, and in that moment, she made a choice. She said that whatever the legalities, the water was a gift from God, intended for all his children. She said that threatening the water supply for the sake of a railroad track was a short-sighted and foolish business. Her words were not a full-throated defense of Eve or the Dine, but they were a clear rebuke of Pike and Klein. They cracked the foundation of their authority. The other men in the saloon, ranchers and merchants who depended on the stability of the region, looked at each other. They had been swayed by Pike's promises of progress, but Agnes Whitlow's words resonated with a deeper, more practical truth. Klein, caught between Eve's unassailable logic and this unexpected shift in public opinion, faltered. He was a bully, and bullies are cowards when confronted with real strength. He looked at Eve's steady gaze, at the silent, disapproving faces of the other men, and he knew he had lost. With a muttered curse, he gestured to the Dine men. "Get out of here," he snarled. He tried to save face, adding a threat that the tax would be collected eventually, but the power had gone out of his voice. The three men walked out of the saloon without a backward glance. Eve closed her ledger, picked it up, and turned to leave. As she stepped out into the blinding sunlight, her heart was pounding, but she held her head high. She had walked into the heart of the storm and had not been broken. Across the street, on the high ridge, Atsidi still sat on his horse. He had seen the Dine men emerge, free. He had seen Eve walk out, safe. Their eyes met across the dusty expanse. No words were needed. His gaze held a profound respect, a deep and quiet understanding of the battle she had just won, and the courage it had taken to fight it. Eve walked the long road back to the station, the ledger in her hand. She was no longer just a cook, no longer a woman in hiding. She was the voice of Red Mesa Station, a guardian of its books and its rights. When she reached the kitchen, the late afternoon sun was pouring through the window, illuminating the small, cheerful yellow curtains she had made. They looked like flags of victory. Eve's victory in the saloon was a temporary truce, not a surrender. She had won with logic and public opinion, but Harlan Pike was a man who played a longer, dirtier game. A week later, a letter arrived with the stagecoach, addressed to Quinn. It was from Pike's lawyer, Mr. Finch. The formal, looping script was a velvet glove on an iron fist. The letter conceded that Quinn was in possession of the original deed. However, it went on to argue, in excruciatingly dense legal prose, that the deed was fundamentally vague. It granted rights to the spring itself, the visible opening at Tubiani, but it made no mention of the watershed, the underground aquifer, or the various smaller seeps and tributaries that fed it. Pike's Railroad, the letter stated, intended to drill new wells higher up the basin, an action that was, according to Finch's interpretation, perfectly within their rights. It was a death sentence delivered by courier. They would not take the spring. They would simply bleed it dry from its source. Quinn's face went gray as he read. The deed, their sacred shield, had been revealed to be full of holes. They had won the battle only to find the enemy had outflanked them on the map. He slumped into a chair, the letter trembling in his hand. All he could say, over and over, was that it was not right. The water was one system. Everyone knew that. Eve stood by the window, her mind racing. The law, she was learning, was not about what was right. It was about what was written, and what was not written could be used as a weapon. She remembered the dusty, crumbling chapel, the sense of forgotten history. Could there be more? Had the old preacher, Father Michael, stored anything else? It was Quinn who remembered. He lifted his head, a flicker of memory in his old eyes. He said Father Michael was more than a preacher. He was a scholar of the land. He had loved maps. He was fascinated by the way water moved, how it appeared in the desert as if by miracle. He had spent a whole summer, Quinn recalled, charting the streams and washes after a season of heavy rain. It was possible. Just possible. He might have made a map to accompany the deed, a document to clarify what everyone at the time had simply understood to be true. There was no choice. They had to go back. This time, Quinn refused to stay behind. His bandaged hand was still tender, but his pride was more deeply wounded. This was his fight, his past, and he would not send a woman and a Navajo warrior to face it for him again. Atsidi appeared at dusk, as he always seemed to when he was most needed. He had seen the official-looking envelope on the stage, and he had read the worry on their faces from his silent vantage point on the mesa. He listened to the story, his face impassive, and when Quinn announced his intention to ride, Atsidi simply nodded. He would lead them. They set out the following morning, a small, grim procession of 3. The sky was a strange, bruised purple in the east, and the air was heavy and thick, charged with a humidity that felt unnatural in the arid land. Atsidi's eyes were constantly on the dark clouds massing over the distant mountains. He said a storm was building in the high country. It would not rain here, not yet, but the mountains were another world. They rode hard, the urgency of their mission a sharp spur. By midday, they were entering the mouth of the narrow, rock-walled canyon that led to the chapel. The air inside the canyon was still and hot, the silence broken only by the clatter of their horses' hooves on the stony ground of the dry wash. The towering red walls seemed to press in on them, and the strip of sky visible above was a menacing, dark gray. The sound began as a low, deep rumble, a vibration felt more in the bones than in the ears. It was a sound that did not belong in the quiet canyon. Atsidi reined in his horse sharply, his head cocked, listening. His body went taut. "Run," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. "Not back. Up." He pointed to a steep, narrow game trail that led up the canyon wall. Quinn stared at him, confused, but Eve saw the look in Atsidi's eyes and needed no further explanation. She spurred her mare, shouting for Quinn to follow. The rumbling was growing louder now, becoming a deafening roar, the sound of 1,000 freight trains bearing down on them. Eve scrambled up the trail, her horse finding footholds where it seemed there were none. She looked back. Quinn was fumbling, his older horse nervous, refusing the steep incline. The roar was all around them, shaking the very rock. And then she saw it, a wall of brown water, 10 feet high, churning with uprooted trees, boulders, and debris, surged around the bend in the canyon. A flash flood, a monster of mud and water unleashed by the storm in the mountains. Atsidi was already off his horse, a coil of rope in his hand. He shouted at Quinn to abandon his mount. The old man, his face white with terror, finally slid from the saddle just as the water hit. The horse was swept away in an instant. A terrified scream swallowed by the roar. The wave slammed into Quinn, knocking him off his feet, dragging him into the raging torrent. Eve screamed his name. Atsidi was already moving, looping one end of his rope around a solid rock outcropping. He worked with a speed and precision that was breathtaking. He threw the other end of the rope out into the churning water, shouting Quinn's name. The old man surfaced, sputtering, his hand flailing. He missed the rope. Without a second's hesitation, Atsidi handed the secured end of the rope to Eve. "Hold this," he commanded. "Do not let go." He plunged into the flood. He was a powerful swimmer, but the current was a vicious, irresistible force. It tore at him, but he fought it, his movement strong and desperate. He reached Quinn just as the old man's head was about to go under again. He got an arm around his chest, and with his free hand, he grabbed the trailing end of the rope. "Now!" Atsidi roared, his voice barely audible over the din. "Pull!" Eve dug her heels into the rocky soil. She wrapped the rope around her hands, the rough hemp biting into her skin. She pulled, her muscles screaming in protest. The weight of two men, plus the incredible force of the water, was an impossible anchor. She felt her feet begin to slide. She was going to lose them. Then another set of hands closed over hers on the rope. It was Quinn, who had managed to get his own grip. And then Atsidi, having secured Quinn, was adding his own strength. They were a chain, a human extension of the rope, fighting the monstrous power of the flood. Eve pulled until black spots danced in her vision, until her arms felt they were being torn from their sockets. She focused on Atsidi's face, his jaw set, his eyes locked on hers, a silent command to hold on, to not give up. Inch by agonizing inch, they dragged themselves out of the main current and toward the relative safety of the canyon wall. They collapsed onto a narrow ledge just above the raging water, a tangled heap of soaked, gasping, and trembling bodies. The roar of the flood filled the world. They had survived. They had held the rope. It was a long time before any of them could speak. They were battered, bruised, and bone-weary, but they were alive. When the floodwaters began to recede, leaving a thick, foul-smelling layer of mud on the canyon floor, they made their way, on foot, to the chapel. The little adobe building had been spared the worst of the flood, protected by a rise in the land. Inside, it was as they had left it, a place of dust and silence. This time, their search was more frantic. In the bottom of the iron strongbox, beneath the Bible, Atsidi's knife found the edge of a false bottom. He pried it up. Beneath it lay a flat, oilcloth-wrapped package. Inside was not a single document, but a thin wooden box. Eve opened it. On top lay a neatly written copy of the deed, and underneath it was a map. It was drawn in black ink on a treated piece of linen. The lines fine and precise, it showed the entire basin, with Red Mesa Station and Tubiani at its center. But it also showed the hidden, secret life of the water. Father Michael had charted the network of underground fissures, the deep aquifer, and the dozens of tiny, unnamed seeps high in the mountains that fed the entire system. He had labeled the whole thing in his elegant script, God's Providence for Red Mesa, a unified system. It was signed and dated. It was the truth of the land, set down on paper. It was the weapon they needed. The journey back was slow and arduous. They had only Eve's and Atsidi's horses, and they had to take turns walking. They avoided the main trails, Atsidi leading them through a series of high, rocky passes. By the second afternoon, Eve felt it again, the prickling sensation of being watched. Atsidi had felt it for hours. He said nothing, but his body was coiled with a watchful tension. Finally, he stopped them in a grove of piñon pine. He told them to wait. He climbed a high rock, shielding his eyes, and scanned their back trail. After a long silence, he pointed. A single rider, a dark speck in the distance, was following their path with an unnerving patience. He was staying far enough back to avoid a direct confrontation. A hunter dogging his prey. They could not outrun him. They were too slow. Atsidi's face was grim. He looked at the terrain around them. His eyes narrowed in calculation. He told Eve to take Quinn and ride ahead through a narrow, sheer-walled pass. He told her not to stop and not to look back, no matter what she heard. Eve's heart hammered against her ribs, but she trusted him. She did as he said, leading the horses into the pass. When they were 100 yards in, she heard a sound that made her flinch, a sharp, cracking roar that echoed off the canyon walls. It was not a gunshot. It was the sound of falling rock. It was followed by the high, terrified scream of a horse, and then silence. She kept going. A half-hour later, Atsidi caught up with them. He was on foot, running with an easy, tireless lope. He said nothing of what had happened. simply took the reins of his horse and swung into the saddle. They reached the station after nightfall, utterly exhausted but safe. As Eve was unsaddling her mare, Quinn came to her side. He said that Atsidi had told him what he saw after the rock slide. The pursuer had been thrown from his dead horse. He had scrambled away on foot, but not before Atsidi had gotten a clear look at his face. It was one of the men who had been standing with Klein in the saloon, a known hired gun for Pike. Later, standing in the quiet kitchen, Eve unrolled the map on the table. The lines and words seemed to glow in the lamplight. This piece of linen was their future. She thought of the journey, of the roaring water and the biting rope, of the silent, menacing rider on their trail. She had come to Red Mesa seeking a place to hide, a quiet harbor from a life she did not want. But she understood now. Staying here was not about finding a sanctuary. It was about choosing a battleground. And as she looked up and saw Atsidi standing in the doorway, his silhouette solid and reassuring against the vast darkness, she knew she had also chosen who she would stand with. The map, their hard-won proof, lay on the kitchen table, a silent promise of a future. But the knowledge of the man on their trail, of Klein's treachery and Pike's ruthlessness, was a poison that seeped into the fragile peace. The fight was no longer a distant legal storm. It was a physical threat, a shadow that clung to the edges of the station. In the days that followed, a strange quiet fell. It was the quiet of a held breath, of a world waiting for the next blow to fall. Atsidi did not return to his people's lands on the far side of the mesa. He stayed, a silent guardian. He did not sleep in the bunkhouse with the other men. He kept to himself, a solitary figure who seemed to draw strength and patience from the land itself. Eve would see him at dawn, standing on the highest point of the corral fence, his eyes scanning the blackened plains. She would see him at dusk, a tall silhouette against the bleeding sky, watching, always watching. Their conversations were brief, practical matters of fence lines and water levels, but beneath the simple words, a current of understanding ran deep and strong. They were partners in a war that had not yet been fully declared. The storm that had caused the flash flood in the high country finally broke over the lowlands. It began in the late afternoon, the sky turning the color of a deep bruise. The rain did not come with the fury of the flood, but with a soft, persistent whisper. It was a cleansing rain, washing the fine gray ash from the scorched earth, turning the black ground into a dark, rich mud. It drummed a gentle, mournful rhythm on the tin roof of the station, a sound that was both soothing and melancholic. Eve had gone out with Atsidi to check on a small herd of horses that had been moved to a sheltered box canyon a mile from the station. The rain caught them there, turning the dry wash into a shallow, fast-moving stream and the world into a blur of gray. They were soaked through in minutes, the cold seeping into their bones. Atsidi led them not back toward the station, but up a slick rock face to a shallow overhang. Tucked beneath it, nearly invisible against the stone, was a small, temporary shelter. A lean-to made of leather hide stretched over a frame of juniper branches. It was a hunter's camp, a place of transit, meant for no more than 2 people. Inside, the space was small and dark, smelling of old wood smoke, damp leather, and the sweet scent of sage. The sound of the rain was a steady, rhythmic drumming on the hides above, isolating them from the rest of the world. They were in a tiny, private universe of sound and shadow. Atsidi worked with his usual quiet efficiency, using a fire drill to coax a tiny, stubborn spark into a small, bright flame in the center of the earthen floor. He fed it scraps of dry juniper bark until a smokeless fire danced, pushing back the damp chill and casting their shadows, large and flickering, against the leather walls. Eve shivered, her teeth chattering, as much from the lingering cold as from a sudden, sharp awareness of their closeness. The space was so small that their knees almost touched as they huddled by the fire. He looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to hold the firelight within them. He reached for a thick woven dine blanket that had been left folded in a dry corner. He did not speak. He simply unfolded it and draped it around her shoulders. The wool was warm and smelled faintly of piñon smoke. The simple, caring gesture undid something inside her. The walls she kept so carefully maintained, the reserve she had cultivated since she was a girl, began to crumble. She found herself talking, her voice low, barely more than a whisper against the sound of the rain. She told him about Gallup. She told him about the man her father had arranged for her to marry, a merchant twice her age with soft, damp hands and eyes that looked at her as if she were a new ledger, a column of assets to be added to his accounts. She explained that it was not the man himself she had fled, but the idea of it, the idea of being owned, of her life being a contract signed and sealed by others. She confessed her deepest fear that to be with a man meant to be possessed, to surrender the very freedom she had risked everything to find. He listened without interrupting, his gaze steady and patient. The firelight carved shadows and planes on his face, making it seem both ancient and immediate. When she fell silent, the story told. He did not offer empty reassurances. He simply shared a piece of his own story, a piece of the wound that he carried. He spoke of the long walk. He did not speak of armies or treaties. He spoke of his grandmother, a small, fierce woman who had taught him the names of the plants and the stories of the stars. He spoke of the sickness in the camp at Huildi and how she had grown weaker and weaker, but her spirit had never broken. She had died on the long journey home, her body buried in a land that was not hers. Before she died, she had made him promise. Protect the water, she had told him, her voice a dry rasp. The water is the memory. It is the blood of the earth. As long as it flows, we are not lost. His voice was flat, without self-pity. But Eve could hear the vast, hollow space her loss had left in him. She understood then that his fight for Tubiani was not about land or rights. It was a sacred vow, a promise to a ghost. He was protecting a memory. They sat in silence, the fire crackling, the rain drumming its endless rhythm. He had lost his past, and she had run from her future. In this small, dark shelter, they were simply two people, stripped of everything but the truth of their own hearts. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing a damp strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was not possessive. It was a question. The air in the small shelter grew thick, charged with all the things they had never said, all the looks that had passed between them in moments of crisis and quiet observation. Eve's breath caught in her throat. She looked at his hand, then into his eyes. Her heart was a wild, frantic bird in her chest. This moment was a precipice, and she did not know the landscape that lay beyond it. The fear she had spoken of, the fear of being owned, rose up in her, cold and sharp. She bit her lip, a nervous habit from childhood. Her voice was a bare thread of sound. What happens after I undress? The question hung in the warm, fire-lit air between them. It was not a question about the physical act, but about its consequence. What would he expect? What would she become? Atsidis' expression did not change, but a deep, gentle warmth came into his eyes. A faint, slow smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was a smile of such profound understanding that it reached a place in her that had always been cold and frightened. He said, his voice as soft as the rain on the roof, "Then you will know. When you want, how you want. Your word is the law." The words were a key, unlocking the cage she had lived in for so long. All the power, all the choice, all the law in this small, sacred space belonged to her. He was not a man who would take. He was a man who would wait, who would honor her choice, whatever it might be. The overwhelming tension in her body did not break. It dissolved, melting away in a wave of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the warmth of absolute safety, of a trust so complete it was a kind of grace. She made her choice. For now. She leaned forward, not to kiss him, but to rest her forehead against his chest. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of him, of rain and wood smoke and the clean, honest smell of the earth. He was solid and real beneath her, a human anchor in a world that had always felt like a storm. His arms came around her, pulling the edges of the warm blanket with them, cocooning them both. They sat like that for a long time, holding each other, a silent, unmoving island in the vast, weeping night. The fire burned low, and the rain whispered its secrets to the land. Tomorrow, the fight would begin again. There would be pike, and the law, and the threat of violence. But in the heart of the storm, they had found their own shelter, a quiet promise to let the morning speak for itself. The quiet that followed the rain was different from the silence of fear. It was a clean, contemplative quiet, the sound of the earth drinking deeply. In the station kitchen, the world felt new. The map, rescued from its long sleep, lay spread on the table, its fine ink lines a declaration of a truth deeper than law books. It was a map of a shared life, a single system of veins and arteries that gave sustenance to all, heedless of property lines or the color of a man's skin. Looking at it, Eve saw not a legal tool, but a foundation. Defense was not enough. Fighting back, ambush for ambush, would only lead to an endless cycle of violence. They had to build something new, something Pike's brand of power could not easily tear down. The idea came to her with the simple clarity of a sunrise. They would not just protect the water, they would formally join in its stewardship. With Quinn's weary but wholehearted blessing, she began. She wrote out a simple, one-page proposal for a Red Mesa water cooperative. It was not a document of dense legal terms, but a plain-spoken agreement. Shared ownership, shared protection, and a rotating schedule for drawing water for livestock and gardens, ensuring no one took more than their share and the spring was never strained. It was a law born of common sense and mutual survival. She sent copies with the freight driver to the handful of small, independent ranchers who lived in the shadow of the mesa. Then she gave a copy to Atsidi. He read it, his dark eyes missing nothing. He then took it to the elders of his people, to his mother, Azah Yazay, and the other clan leaders who held the true authority. While the community considered her proposal, Atsidi went to work. The old blacksmith's shed, long silent, came to life. The rhythmic, ringing clang of a hammer on an anvil became a new heartbeat for the station. Eve would watch him from the kitchen window, his powerful back and arms slick with sweat as he worked the glowing iron. He was not making weapons. He was forging the tools of a new future. He shaped sturdy hooks to clear debris from the stream beds, hammered out collars for rudimentary pipes to channel water more efficiently, and crafted the sharp, durable head of a well-digger. His work was a physical manifestation of their plan, a promise hammered into steel. He was building, not just guarding. He was a smith, a maker, as his name implied. The news of a formal alliance, a proposed legal entity that would unite the settlers and the Dien reached Harlan Pike like a declaration of war. He had tried fire, legal intimidation, and hired guns. Each time, the small community at Red Mesa had not just survived, they had grown stronger, more unified. He knew he had to break the one person who was the linchpin of the entire alliance, Eve. For this task, he brought in a new kind of weapon, a man named Morrison. He was a bounty hunter, but his true trade was in whispers and secrets. He was a man who believed every person had a past they wanted to bury, and he was an expert at digging up graves. He arrived in town not with a gun on his hip, but with a friendly demeanor and a wallet full of whiskey money. He sat in the saloon, listening, asking questions. He traveled to Gallup. A week later, Morrison rode out to Red Mesa Station. He was a heavy-set man with a confident, easy smile and cold, calculating eyes. He did not ask for Pike. He asked for Eve. He claimed to be a writer for a territorial newspaper, doing a story on the resilience of frontier women. He spoke to her on the porch, his questions circling like buzzards. He asked about her family, her journey west, her life before the station. His inquiries were expertly veiled, but Eve felt their sharp, probing points. He asked why a woman of her obvious breeding and intelligence was working in such a remote place. He wondered aloud if she had left behind any attachments, perhaps a suitor or a husband. The threat was a quiet poison in his friendly words. She gave him nothing but polite, brief answers. And after an hour of this verbal fencing, he tipped his hat and rode away. But Eve knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he had not found what he was looking for, but he would not stop until he had fabricated it. The meeting was held 2 days later in the station's largest empty structure, a long warehouse that had once been used for storing freight. The cavernous space was cleared, and benches, crates, and chairs were arranged in a wide semicircle. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. The whole of their small, embattled world was gathered there. The local ranchers, their faces weathered and skeptical. Quinn and the station hands, their loyalty a solid presence, and, filing in with a quiet, profound dignity, the Dine. Azai Yazai led them, her back straight, her silver and turquoise jewelry gleaming in the lantern light. Atsidi stood with them, his stillness a formidable counterpoint to the nervous energy in the room. Eve stood before them all, her heart hammering but her voice steady. She unrolled Father Michael's map and pinned it to the warehouse wall. She did not begin with legal arguments. She began with the land. She pointed to the map, to the network of lines that showed how the life of the valley was interconnected, how the smallest seep in the high mountains was a cousin to the well they drank from. She spoke of the fires, the one in the barn and the one on the plains. She spoke of how they had fought them together. Then she held up her proposal. She read it aloud, her voice clear and strong. She proposed a council, with members from both the ranchers and the Dine, to oversee the cooperative. She proposed a pact of mutual defense, not just of the water, but of each other. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Then, a voice boomed from the back, a voice full of false sincerity. "It is a beautiful story, Miss Hart, truly inspiring." Morrison stepped forward into the lantern light, a mocking smile on his face. He held a piece of paper in his hand. He said he had been doing some research for his article, and he had found another story, a story from a town called Gallup. He proceeded to paint a vile, twisted picture. He spoke of a dutiful father and a respectable merchant. He spoke of a sacred promise of marriage, a contract which Miss Hart had broken without cause. He depicted her as a faithless runaway, a woman who had shirked her responsibilities. Then his voice dropped, taking on a conspiratorial, menacing tone. He looked from Eve to Atsidi, who had not moved a muscle. "And now," he said, "this same woman, who scorns the sacred bonds of her own people, asks you to trust her. She stands with a Navajo warrior, a man of a different race." He let the words hang in the air, stirring the dark, deep-seated prejudices of the frontier. He reminded them that the territory had laws against the cohabitation of whites and natives. He was not just attacking her character. He was threatening her with prison. He was trying to smash the very foundation of their alliance with the hammer of bigotry. The room was deathly quiet. The ranchers shifted uncomfortably. The seeds of doubt had been planted. Eve stood her ground. She did not look at Morrison. She looked at the faces of the people before her. When she spoke, her voice did not tremble. "Much of what Mr. Morrison says is true," she said, her honesty a shocking counterblow. The crowd murmured. "I did leave my home. I did walk away from a marriage that my father had arranged." She took a breath, and her gaze swept across the room, meeting every eye she could. "But he did not tell you why. He did not tell you that the man I was to marry saw me not as a wife, but as property. He did not tell you that my father, in his grief, saw the marriage as a business transaction. I left because I believe a woman is a person, not a bargaining chip. I believe my life is my own, to build or to break as I see fit. And I believe that my word, when I give it, is a sacred thing. I would not give it to a man I did not respect." She turned her head and looked directly at Atsidi, and then back at the crowd. "I have given my word to Red Mesa Station. I have given my word to the people who stand with me tonight. The question you have to ask is not about my past. It is about your future. Who do you believe will honor their word? The man who sent fire to your fields, or the people who stood with you and fought the flames? The silence that followed was different. It was a silence of consideration, of weighing and judging. It was Agnes Whitlow who broke it. She stood up, her posture as rigid as ever, but her face was set with a new, fierce conviction. "I do not know what happened in Gallup," she said, her sharp voice cutting through the tension. "And frankly, I do not care. I have seen enough of men like Mr. Pike and his hired mouthpieces to know that they twist the truth as easily as a blacksmith bends a hot iron." She looked around at the other women in the room, then at the ranchers. "What I care about," she continued, "is that my cattle have water. I care about my children not getting sick from a well that has gone dry. I saw the fire that this man's employer started. It came within a mile of my own home, and I saw who fought it. I saw Miss Hart, and I saw these Dine men." She gestured toward Atsidi and the elders. "They did not ask about contracts or deeds. They saved our homes." Her gaze settled on Morrison, as cold and hard as river ice. "I will put my trust and my family's future in the hands of the people who protect the water, not the ones who try to steal it." Her words were a dam breaking. A rancher stood up and said he agreed. Then another, a wave of assent. A low rumble of voices moved through the warehouse. The agreement was made, the cooperative was born. But there was the matter of signing. A written document would mean little to the Dine elders, for whom a spoken promise and a handshake were the law. It was Atsidi who provided the solution. He left the warehouse and returned a moment later from his forge, carrying a wide, clean plank of pine and a clay bowl filled with fine charcoal dust. He set them on a barrel in the center of the room. He said that this agreement was not just ink on paper. It was a promise made to the land itself. It should be sealed with the earth. One by one, they came forward. Quinn went first, pressing his hand. The burned one. Into the black dust and then firmly onto the board. Then Adzayazi, her small, wrinkled hand leaving a surprisingly clear print. The ranchers followed, their big, calloused hands leaving their own marks. A new kind of document was being created, a testament written not in script, but in the elemental language of charcoal and wood, of community and shared purpose. When the last person had pressed their hand to the board, it was covered in the black prints, a mosaic of commitment, a new law forged on the anvil of their shared struggle. The plank of pine, covered in the charcoal handprints of their new alliance, was propped against the kitchen wall like a sacred text. For 2 days, a fragile, hopeful peace settled over Red Mesa Station. The ranchers who had signed the agreement rode out to check on their own lands, promising to return in a week to help formalize the cooperative and file the papers at the county seat. The Dine returned to their own camps, leaving a small, watchful party, led by Atsidi, as guardians. It was the quiet before the final, desperate strike. The attack came on the third night. There was no warning, no rumble of approaching riders. The first sound was the one that every soul in the arid territory dreaded most, the slow, grinding death of the well pump sucking air. It was a groan, then a hollow, rattling gasp. The water was gone. Atsidi was the first to move, a shadow detaching itself from the porch. Eve met him in the yard, her heart a cold stone in her chest. From the direction of Tebeyani came a new set of sounds. Alien to the desert night, the rhythmic clang of heavy hammers on iron, the shouts of foremen, and the tortured groan of straining wagon wheels. Torches bloomed in the darkness, a string of angry, moving stars. In their flickering, hellish light, the truth was revealed. A massive crew of men, 100 strong, swarmed over the spring. They were not just diverting the water with a crude ditch. They were building, under the armed guard of a dozen rough-looking men. They were laying a railroad spur, driving steel spikes into wooden ties, burying the sacred ground under a brutal, iron geometry. Harlan Pike was not just trying to steal the water. He was obliterating its source. creating an irreversible fact on the ground before the sun rose. By morning, the spring would be gone, and a railroad track, a symbol of federal power and undeniable progress, would be in its place. A cold, precise rage cleared Eve's mind. While Atsidi gathered his warriors, their faces grim and hard in the torchlight, she ran to the warehouse, now their community hall. She roused the women, the old men, and the boys who were too young to fight but old enough to work. She told them they could not stop the armed men, but they could save themselves. The well was dry because Pike's crew had breached the main channel, but smaller, secondary channels still fed the earth. They had to build a dam, a temporary wall to catch what little water was left and divert it back toward the station's well and the gardens. As Atsidi and his 10 warriors melted into the darkness, moving like ghosts toward the chaotic noise of the construction, Eve led her own small army. They worked in a frantic, desperate silence, filling grain sacks with sand and rock, their hands raw, their backs screaming. They were not warriors with rifles. They were custodians of life, fighting for every last drop. The confrontation at the spring was a standoff of fire and shadow. Atsidi and his men emerged from the rocks, a silent, menacing line between Pike's crew and the land. The foreman, a big, belligerent man with a pistol on his hip, ordered them to stand down. Atsidi's voice was low and calm, but it carried over the clang of the hammers. "This land is protected," he said. "This water is life. You will go no further." Pike's guards raised their rifles. The laborers, caught in the middle, hesitated, their hammers falling silent. The air grew thick, humming with the promise of violence. The first shot did not come from the line of guards. It came from a cluster of boulders off to the side, a coward's shot from the dark. A searing pain tore through the air, but it was not one of the warriors who fell. It was Quinn. He had followed the men, unable to stay behind, and had been standing near the edge of the confrontation with Tommy, who had crept out to watch. The shot had been aimed at Atsidi, but as the rifle cracked, Tommy had stumbled forward in fright. Quinn, with the pure, unthinking instinct of a protector, had thrown himself in front of the boy. The bullet slammed into his chest. He crumpled to the ground without a sound. For a heartbeat, the world froze. The hammering, the shouting, the wind itself seemed to stop. Then chaos erupted. The dying warriors did not need an order. They opened fire, not a wild volley, but a series of precise, aimed shots that sent Pike's guards scrambling for cover. In that same instant, Atsidi was no longer a calm leader. He was an avenging spirit. His eyes, burning with a cold fire, had pinpointed the muzzle flash. He moved with a speed that was not quite human, flowing over the rocks toward the sniper's nest. Eve, hearing the gunfire, left the work at the dam and ran toward the spring, her heart choked with a terror she could not name. She saw Quinn on the ground, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. Shiazi, the healer, who had been with the women, was already kneeling beside him, her face a mask of concentration. The gunfight was brief and brutal. In the swirling confusion of torchlight and shadow, a new drama unfolded. The bounty hunter, Morrison, seeing the entire enterprise collapsing into a bloody failure, made his move. He cornered Harlan Pike, who was trying to slink away into the darkness. He grabbed Pike by the collar, his voice a venomous hiss. "This is over. Harlan, your plan is shot to hell, but my silence can still be bought. You will pay me double, or I will tell the sheriff that I saw you give the order to shoot." The treachery was laid bare for all to see. The two men, so recently allies in crime, were now antagonists in their own squalid play. A scream of pain from the rocks signaled the end of another fight. Atsidi emerged, dragging a whimpering, bleeding figure behind him. It was Deputy Klein, his legs shattered by a well-placed shot, his face a mess of terror and agony. Atsidi threw him to the ground in front of Pike and Morrison. The architect of the ambush and his conspirators were all present, their guilt illuminated by the pitiless torchlight. The night bled into the gray, exhausted light of dawn. The railroad crew had long since fled, leaving behind a scar of half-finished track and the silence of their abandoned tools. The first rays of sun touched a scene of quiet devastation. The station was saved. The water was slowly beginning to seep back into the makeshift dam, but the cost was etched on every face. They had carried Quinn to a large tent, a way station for the stage line, and laid him on a cot. He was conscious, but his breathing was a shallow, painful rasp. The sheriff, summoned by a rancher hours before, arrived with 2 deputies to find a grim, silent crowd gathered outside the tent. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of blood and impending loss. Quinn's face was the color of old parchment. Eve sat beside him, holding his good hand. Atsidi stood like a stone sentinel at the foot of the cot. The captured Klein, propped against a tent pole, his leg crudely splinted, was ready to confess anything to save his own skin. Eve held up the original deed, its vellum glowing in the dawn light. She read its clear, unwavering declaration of Quinn's rights. Then, in a flat, emotionless voice, she recounted Klein's confession, how Pike had paid him to organize the ambush at the chapel, how he had been promised a share of the railroad's profits, how he had fired the shot that struck Quinn. The sheriff, a weary, honest man, listened, his pen scratching across the pages of his notebook. When she was finished, he looked at Pike and Morrison, who stood under guard. He shook his head, a gesture of profound disgust. He ordered his deputies to put them in irons. Justice, in its slow, methodical way, had finally arrived. As they led Pike away, Quinn's eyes fluttered open. He looked at Eve, a faint, sad smile on his lips. His voice was a bare whisper, a rustle of dry leaves. He told her the station was hers now. He had no one else. His words were a last will and a final blessing. "Keep the kitchen warm, Eve," he whispered, his grip on her hand so weak it was like a memory. "Keep the water flowing." His eyes closed. His hand went limp in hers. A single, shuddering breath escaped his lips, and then he was still. Eve sat there as the sun rose higher, the warmth of the new day unable to touch the cold, hollow space that had just opened inside her. The fight was over. They had won. But in the quiet of the tent, with the body of the kind, decent man who had given her a home lying before her, all she could feel was the terrible, crushing weight of the price. The dust settled slowly, both on the land and in the hearts of the people. The sheriff's wagon, carrying Pike, Morrison, and a moaning Klein, had disappeared over the horizon, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than any noise. The half-finished railroad track lay like a rusted metal snake, a monument to a brutal ambition that had failed. The victory felt hollow, the air thin and cold without Quinn's steady presence. They buried him on a small rise overlooking the station, a place where he had liked to watch the sunset. There was no preacher, no formal service. The people of the station, the ranchers, and the dinna stood together, a silent, mixed congregation under the vast, indifferent sky. Astza Yazai laid a small bundle of sage on the fresh earth. It sent a clean, sharp prayer in the cool air. Eve said a few simple words, her voice thick but clear, speaking not of loss, but of the home he had built and the kindness he had shown. He was the heart of the station, and they would keep that heart beating. In the days that followed, the law of the outside world made its slow, grinding way to Red Mesa. A letter from the county seat confirmed that Harlan Pike and his conspirators would face trial for a list of crimes that included attempted murder and unlawful seizure of resources. Another letter, this one from the Transcontinental Railroad, was couched in cool, corporate language, disavowing all knowledge of Pike's methods, but announcing that, due to unforeseen geological and social complications, the planned spur line would be rerouted 20 miles to the south. The Red Mesa Water Cooperative, with its clear map and unified front, was officially recognized, its rights to the Biani and its entire watershed secured. The paper war was over. But the real healing took place not in a courtroom, but in the station kitchen. On the evening of the first new moon after Quinn's passing, Eve lit every lantern and put the largest stew pot she owned on the stove. People came, drawn by the light and the smell of roasting meat and vegetables. They came carrying their own contributions, a sack of potatoes, a freshly baked loaf of bread, a jar of wild berry preserves. They ate together, their shared grief a quiet bond between them. After the meal, Atsidi brought in the plank of pine, its surface covered in the black handprints of their promise. With one of his fine smithing tools, he began to carefully, painstakingly carve the outline of each handprint into the wood, making the mark permanent. When he was finished, he and another man mounted the plank on the wall above the hearth, where Quinn's old rifle had once hung. It was their constitution, their treaty, sealed not in a government office, but in the warm heart of their home. A few days later, Eve walked with Atsidi to Tobayani. The ugly scar of the construction was still there, but the water flowed around it, clear and undeterred. Small green shoots were already pushing their way up through the disturbed earth. They stood by the edge of the spring, the source of all their struggle and their unity. Eve looked at the water, then at the tall, quiet man beside her. She knew that in the eyes of the world, they were an impossible pairing. But here, in this place, the world's rules seemed foolish and small. She asked him what came next. For them. He did not answer immediately. He picked up a smooth, flat stone and skipped it across the surface of the pool. It danced 3 times before sinking without a ripple. He told her that his people did not have a word for the kind of marriage she had run from, a contract of ownership. He said a man and a woman walk a path together. Sometimes the path is smooth, sometimes it is rocky, but they walk it together because they choose to. Every morning when the sun rises, the path is the promise, not the destination. He turned to her, his dark eyes serious and gentle. I will not own you, Evelyn Hart, and you will not own me, but I will choose to walk this path with you, today and every day that follows. If you will choose to walk it with me. It was the most beautiful proposal she could have ever imagined. It was not a promise of forever, but a promise of now, repeated over and over. It was the only kind of promise that felt real. She told him yes, she would choose him, every day. Their joining was as simple and honest as their conversation. It took place not in a church, but in the open air of the station yard, witnessed by the small, unlikely family they had forged. Azza Yaze stood as their elder, her face a mask of proud, serene approval. Agnes Whitlow was there, her presence a testament to her own profound journey. Tommy stood proudly beside Atsidi, his arm now healed, a small scar the only reminder of the ambush. Atsidi gave Eve a ring. It was not gold or silver, but a simple, dark band carved from juniper wood, polished smooth as stone. It had been his grandmother's, he said, a blessing from the memory he held so sacred. Eve had nothing to give him in return but a promise, which she spoke aloud, her voice carrying in the clear desert air. She promised to keep the kitchen warm. She promised to keep the ledgers true. She promised to choose him. It was all she had to give, and it was everything. Life settled into a new rhythm, the rhythm of building the Red Mesa Water Cooperative. Once a desperate idea became a working reality. A council, with Atsidi and Agnes Whitlow among its members, met once a month to set the schedules and plan for the dry season. Atsidi, using his skill as a smith, built a system of small, ingenious gates and channels that made the water sharing fair and efficient. Eve's small herb garden expanded. With the help of the Dine women, she learned to grow squash, beans, and the tough, resilient blue corn that could survive the desert heat. The garden became a symbol of their new world, a place where different roots took hold in the same soil, nourished by the same water. Agnes Whitlow, in her own surprising transformation, saw another need. The children of the station and the surrounding ranches had no school. She began a fund, and soon A small classroom was established in the now-repaired warehouse. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, Eve would teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. On Wednesdays, Astza Yazi and other dying women would come and teach the old ways how to weave the patterns of the world into a blanket, how to find edible roots, how to listen to the language of the wind and the stories of the stars. It was a new kind of education, born of two worlds, preparing the children for the future by grounding them in the past. One evening, months later, Eve stood on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky. A soft rain had begun to fall, a gentle, life-giving rain that smelled of wet dust and sage. The sound on the tin roof was a quiet, steady drumming. She could hear the murmur of conversation from the bunkhouse, the soft nicker of a horse in the corral. From the kitchen behind her came the warm, yellow glow of lantern light and the scent of baking bread. Atsidi was inside, mending a piece of harness, his hands sure and steady. The water was flowing. The kitchen was warm. This was not the life she had imagined for herself, but it was a life she had chosen, a life she had built, a life she would continue to choose every single day. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know where you are tuning in from in the comments so we can all connect and share. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and press the hype button to support us and help this story be heard.